Hello everyone, today June 6th. As usual, we're going to take a few minutes to look at key markets and economic trends in order to get a better idea of what may be lying ahead for us over the coming months. So without further ado, if we turn to markets, we've essentially seen a continuation of recent trends. Although equities were a little bit more volatile and nervous in the face of US inflation, we'll talk about that in a minute, but overall the uptrend was definitely sustained, whereas for bonds it's actually the absence of any trends that we have seen ongoing, although the last few days and weeks have rather been positive. And as I was just saying, the key factor for markets remains US inflation, which is persisting above the 3% level for almost a year now, and we would actually need a lot more than just 5 minutes to cover the inflation situation. But one important point to note is that a lot of the things that are holding US inflation this high is actually within shelter or housing inflation. If you exclude shelter, you would actually be around 2% for some time. Now, of course, in real life, you can't just exclude housing. But what's interesting this time around and for inflation is the fact that the way shelter inflation is being measured makes it a highly lagging component of inflation. And if you look at more timely measures of housing inflation, you do see that a slowdown is in the cards, which is not to say that all is well on this front, but in theory, time should be an ally for inflation, bearing any surprises. Now, if we look at the Canadian situation, the slowdown is much more striking. We've been below 3% for essentially 4 months now, and just 1.2% if you exclude shelter. Now, of course, the housing situation in Canada is way different than in the US, and it's not even measured the same way that it's being measured our side of the border. But what makes an exclusion interesting and informative is, among other things, the fact that within shelter, you actually have the Bank of Canada own rate hikes through mortgage interest rate costs. So indeed, if inflation is markedly slowing in Canada and eventually in the US, you should gradually see markets turn their attention to how the labor market is actually responding to that. And for now, the situation is rather positive. The unemployment rate remains historically low. But if you look at the situation globally, you do see that pressures are mounting. Actually, at least that's the message we're getting from the Fed of Kansas City Labor Market Conditions Index, which essentially aggregates 24 different measures of labor market conditions. Now, perhaps it is because we've just passed through a historic period of labor shortages that nowadays businesses are doing everything they can to avoid layoffs. And if that's the case, that's all for the better, but eventually we'll have to see a stabilization in global labor market conditions. Otherwise, we may end up being surprised by the rise in the unemployment rate. And indeed, that's the hope being that rate cuts will provide that much needed breathing space to the economy, to the labor market. We've had a first rate cut in Canada just yesterday, actually. And the Fed should probably follow suit over the course of the year, perhaps as soon as in September. Other central banks in Europe have also cut their policy rates recently. So as you can see, we are finally turning the corner on the monetary policy front, and we should expect more rate cuts over the course of the year. But we're not talking about an imminent return to accommodative policy rates. That would require a much more difficult economic backdrop that we are currently seeing as of now. So 3 takeaways to conclude. Essentially more of the same for US inflation stagnating above 3%. The economy also proving rather resilient and markets responding to that. But if you look under the surface, you do see that things are slowing down very concretely for Canadian inflation, but eventually also for US inflation and the labor market, which is a good news in the sense that it's opening the door to rate cuts, as we've seen in Canada, in Europe. And if the US follows suit, that may very well provide reasons to continue to celebrate on the equity market fronts, but also for bonds. We'll have to keep an eye on how labor market conditions evolve, because an upside surprise on the unemployment rate may end up taking off guard equities which are already showing a lot of optimism. That's it for today. We'll talk again in September, and I'm wishing you all a great summer.